As I hear them talk, I'm reminded of one of my favorite quotes, which is this idea that hope is belief in the plausibility of the possible as opposed to the necessity of the probable. And so one of the things that we always think about at the SNF Agora Institute is how we make the possible more probable, which is one of the things that we're trying to do. And so I think this next panel will help us think about some of those questions. Before we move into the next panel, I should just say that we were hoping to be joined today also by Nadia Abdallah, who is going to speak about her experience grappling with questions about mental health and democracy. But connection bedevils us in many ways, and she was not able to connect this morning, and so she was very sorry that she couldn't join us for this conversation. But I'd like to invite our next panel up to stage now. And this next panel is going to be called Intergenerational Reflections on Mental Health in Activism. And I think we'll really build on the conversation that we just had this morning. We've asked two leaders from different movements around the world to share lessons that they've learned about preserving their own mental health and sense of agency in the face of repression and democratic failure. So Verónica Matus is a lawyer and vice president of La Morada, Women's Development Corporation in Chile. She has been a feminist activist in her country since the time of the Pinochet dictatorship and has a wealth of experience to share with us. David Hogg is a gun control advocate and co-founder of March for Our Lives, which is a youth-led movement born out of a tragic school shooting that now promotes civic engagement, education, and direct action. And moderating their conversation is one of my colleagues, Consuelo Amat, who is an SNF Agora assistant professor of political science, an expert in state repression, resistance, and development of civil society in authoritarian regimes. And I just want to remind everyone again that for those of you who are joining us online, you can use the online portal to ask questions, and for everyone else, you can use the QR code to submit any questions. So I'll turn it over to Consuelo.
Thank you very much, Hari. Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be able to moderate what I hope will be a fascinating intergenerational discussion about the intersection of mental health and democracy. I wanted to start by framing the discussion and telling you a little bit more about these two inspiring movement leaders. So Verónica Matus is a prominent feminist leader in Chile who has been organizing for women's rights her entire life, before the Pinochet dictatorship, during the dictatorship, and after the transition in 1990. The feminist movements across many countries in the world have that privileged vantage point of having gone through many different regime types, from democracies to totalitarian governments, and therefore a deep legacy. And the feminist movement in Chile is no different. Verónica has worked with many women who have been victims of violence and discrimination, and these victims sometimes speak up and discover a sense of purpose through trauma, and others remain deeply burdened and isolated. These problems were even more acute during the military dictatorship, when people had to live underground and survive in secrecy. And so but the mental health challenges really for social movement leaders are not just limited to those who live underground and who suffer from state violence. High visibility, as we've been discussing, can also be very detrimental to mental health, especially in difficult political environments and polarization. Our other panelist, David Hogg, knows this all too well, as he has been thrust into a hotly contested issue of gun control in the United States after he survived a horrific mass shooting in his high school in Florida. David is an inspiring figure who has turned to agency and solidarity through the March for Our Lives movement, which continues to seek political change in the country. So now let's get started with the first question, and I'd like to start with you, David. Could you share with us a personal story about your experience with March for Our Lives that has deeply moved you?
Sure. I think one of the most powerful stories in my experience with March for Our Lives was in Dallas, Texas in 2018. After we did our marches around the country and the world, we had 800 marches. For context, we had 800 marches about a month and a half after the shooting, the point of which was to rally our generation and people of all ages to unite against gun violence and call for stronger gun laws and to stand up against the gun industry and lobby that prevented changing gun laws in line with the majority will of the American people. So we had about 800,000 people with us in Washington, D.C., marching with us in the largest youth-led protest since the Vietnam War. And after that, we did a tour across the country to go where young people had marched, but youth voter turnout had historically been low, but they could defeat NRA-backed incumbents if they just turned out and voted more. And one of the places that we ended up visiting on this tour was in Dallas, Texas. And at these events, we would have town halls where we would have members of the community, survivors of gun violence, activists, and others talking together about what we can do about this. And outside of a lot of these events, we would be protested by armed counter-protesters. So many of you are not American, so this may not make sense to you. But in America, in many states, it's legal for you to fully carry a military-grade weapon in public, including to protest children that don't want to die from gun violence. And Dallas, Texas was one of those instances. There we had about 20 people standing outside of our event screaming that we weren't real, that the government created the school shooting at our school because they want to take everybody's guns away to create a totalitarian regime, and spreading ridiculous conspiracy theories about it. And one of these armed counter-protesters was screaming that I was a paid FBI agent. I know. That I was paid to work for the government, that I was part of some massive conspiracy to take everybody's guns away. And I went out and did what any sane person would do as an 18-year-old, and I talked to this armed 45-plus-year-old, 220-pound-plus man. I don't know what that is in kilograms, but it's a good amount. And he screams at me and he says, "Why are you trying to take my guns away?" And I say, "Well, you know, are you trying to hurt yourself or somebody else?" And he says, "No, of course I'm not." I said, "Okay, well, I'm not trying to take your guns away, and if I was, it'd be through due process with the right to counsel and a court order." Because, like Deb mentioned earlier, I explained my own story next, and I said, in Parkland, the shooter at my high school made multiple threats against my high school. He threatened to shoot kids in my school and owned an AR-15 legally as a 19-year-old. Do you think, and I said to this man, I said, do you think somebody in Dallas that owns the same gun that you're holding right now, a 19-year-old that owns the same gun you're holding right now, should be able to go out and threaten to shoot a high school, your local high school up, and continue to legally own that gun? And he said, no, of course not. And I said, well, guess what? They can. That's why we're here right now, because we're trying to stop Dallas from becoming the next Parkland. And then from that, he started to realize that he agreed with us on some of our stuff, and this perception that he had created, that he had been fed through social media, right, was false. That we really were just kids, not part of some shadowy government conspiracy to take everybody's guns, that we just don't want our friends to die in school anymore. And what it reminded me of a little bit was, you know, to bring it back to Greece, Plato's allegory of the cave, right? Social media had painted him this projection of what he thought reality was. But when we took him to the outside world and showed him the actual reality, he realized that it wasn't correct anymore. And he actually ended up breaking down and crying. And I, 20 minutes after starting talking to this man, found myself having to comfort the man that was just previously threatening us, right? And I think that was really moving to me because it showed me the power of education. And even though it would have been easy, and I've done it many times before, to go out to him and scream, you know, different expletives at him, and justifiably so, that's not what's going to make progress on this, right? And I have to decide, do I want to just continue the fight from social media in person, or do I actually want to make change? And I want to make change because I don't want to have to be on stages like this anymore talking about this, because I want these stories to be in our history books and not our headlines, right? So if I have to make that sacrifice and talk to that guy and do that, even though he should be the adult in the room, I'm willing to do that.
Thank you, David. That's really inspiring, especially speaking earlier about the power of dialogue coming from stories and powerful stories, personal stories. So now I'll turn to Verónica, and a slightly different question for you, but related, given I just wanted to get started with a personal story so we can get to know you more. But could you share with us a story about your life that reflects how you keep the joy and the motivation in your movement, given how important I think for movements to stay alive and sustained during difficult times, there has to be some joy in it as well.
Well, more than 7 decades. You have a long time and you have many experiences to share. I would say, first, I was 21 years for the coup in Chile 50 years ago. Suddenly, history changed absolutely. And in that context, where we began to see the most horrible human rights violations, at the same time, women were out in the streets at that moment, and they were trying to do everything to help the other. So this feminist movement that was raised during a dictatorship shows you how power and purpose has these two sides. You have the terrific things you're living, but also you have the purpose. And behind the purpose is the desire to put an end to all these experiences. And I think that women could do it very well during the dictatorship, because we had a motto that said, democracy in the country and democracy at home. And this breaks the public and the private spheres. We want to change it in the public, but we also have to change politics in the private. And this, under this motto, every woman of every age could feel that was a part of it. It was not like the other mottos. They're always calling for success, and we're going to have an exit or that. And this movement grew during the dictatorship. When in 2019 there was a revolt in Chile, the feminist movement came out with all the force. It was a young feminist movement. I don't know if you know that performance of the thesis called A Rapist in Your Path. Were 5,000 women doing this performance. And young women had taken this legacy that the old feminists had brought there. That's why I really believe in this intergenerational conversations or developing of these dialogues. It's much more than be sitting together. It's to see and to dive in the memory that's there. After this performance of many women with the performance of the rapist in your path, I was sitting in the NGO where I work, and many women rang the bell many times to tell about the stories of abuse they had been many years ago. And that's why it's so important. After this performance, women that never talked during 50, 40, 60 years were able to ring a bell, go to a place where women could listen to her stories and say, this happened to me. And that's the importance of movement. And that's why I was thinking about purpose. Because in purpose, it's also our desire. It's personal and it's politic. It's personal and it's collective. It's desire. And when desire gets to, it cannot be work in isolation. You need collective action. I need to see your faces. I need to talk with others. I need to see the difference. So I would say that in life there's joy, and also it's the other side. But I would say that humanity, my humanity, is not me only sitting in this chair. It's all of us, and it's all of the women that have been doing for many years, stubbornly, getting and opening their experience to build better democracies, because democracy is the way of daily living we have. And I think that the experience of the women's movement brings that to the politics. Huh? It's daily living. It's not abstraction. It's our bodies, huh? With our ages, with our colors, with our race, whatever it is. Huh? So I would say that movements today are a very important to learn by listening to their purpose, because behind that purpose is the desire of the young people to change the world, to put an end for these horrible things we are seeing every day. And, well, that's it.
Thank you, Vero. One thing that I've seen, I study mainly state repression, but I see a lot of connections between what you're two talking about in terms of it's a different type of political violence, but it's really, we were talking earlier about kind of cultural violence in society, whether it's against women or whether it's against children in schools. And there's a lot of interesting things that we could talk about, how these movements can get connected. How can the youth movement for gun control get together with the feminist movement in the United States or even globally to talk about political violence from the grassroots rather than this state violence, which is what we're discussing today. So, all right, so next question I wanted to talk about was the challenges at the intersection of democracy and mental health. So just if you could, David, if you could tell us a little bit about, from your experience, the connection and the intersection between democracy and mental health, some of the challenges that you've lived with the movement.
Well, I mean, it's one of those things where you can talk about the symptom all you want, or you could talk about the cause. The symptom is mental health, and the cause is our democracy, and our government is failing in the United States, frankly. I mean, it's enshrined in our preamble in the Constitution, the need for our government to help ensure the domestic tranquility. If our kids are dying every day in school, pretty practically, and every day in their communities, and we can't do our government cannot do the very minimal thing of keeping us safe, right? I could talk all day about mental health, right? But I need to talk about what's actually causing the mental health crisis in America, which I think the biggest part of it is social media, certainly, but I think it's also the fact that our government is failing. The US government is failing our people, right? It's not failing corporations, certainly. It's not failing the 1%, but it's failing the 99%. And it's especially failing our children and our future. And it's failing to keep us safe in schools. And it just worries me because we can talk all we want about mental health over and over and over again, but it's not going to change the fact that, we could talk about how to treat bullet wounds better with better trauma surgeons, or we could talk about how to stop people from getting shot in the first place, right? We could talk about how we can get black and brown kids better mental health care for the shootings that happen outside of schools every day in the United States that don't make it on TV nearly as much as Parkland does. Or we could talk about these systemic factors that actually play into that, such as redlining and systemic racism and inequality. The reason why Parkland doesn't have shootings on a daily basis isn't because we have the strongest gun laws in the country. It's because our community is basically in the 1% to 2%. The average median household income in the in our community in Parkland is well over $100,000 a year per household, right? There are communities with the same gun laws that experience substantially more gun violence, and it's because they don't have resources, right? Gun laws can help us, but we need to address why these things are happening in the first place, why somebody is picking up a gun. And we need to stop acting as if, oftentimes people talk about the shooter at my high school as just being a mentally ill, deranged individual. And that's certainly true, right? He did have mental illness. But the reality is this: 2/3 of gun deaths in the United States are suicides. Too often, I think we hear, after there's been a mass shooting, typically committed by a white man, just statistically speaking, in the United States, such as a school shooting, we just talk about mental health over and over and over again, when the reality is this: hatred is not a mental illness. Systemic racism is not a mental illness. Inequality is not a mental illness, right? These are systemic factors, and we can talk about mental health all we want, but ultimately we need to ask ourselves the question: when are we going to actually challenge those in power that are stopping us from making the change that we need, that are also making our mental health bad in the first place? So that's the way that I see the connection between mental health and democracy. Is, it's a symptom of a failing system.
Right, and I'll come back to you after Verónica, if you could speak about later, David, about challenges within the movement as well. So you've been talking more about the external challenges of facing the issues you're facing in your movement, but internally as a movement, what are some of the challenges related to democracy and mental health? So Verónica, can you speak about some of the challenges at the intersection of democracy and mental health in your experience in your movements?
Well, first, I feel that the intersectional perspective opens a whole world, or new ways of looking at the world too. The feminist movement learned about intersection first with the Black women's movement that came from the North, and then the Latin American women had to develop our own intersectional crosses to see how the experience of gender, of race, of patriarchy, it crosses everything. And this leads us to different democracies. What I'm very proud about it, and I've learned in feminism, is that we can look the world as black and white, or yes and no, as the plebiscites we've had in our country, because there's a whole range between the yes and no. And humanity has to develop this whole range, because the point to move through it's not in these ends. So dichotomic perspectives are always living aside a great part of humanity, and that brings that to democracy. Another thing that it's very important for us is, and I insist in this, of the public and the private sphere, and how we move between, for example, the ideas of violence of the state and violence in the private sphere, for example, in the family. Latin America is one of the continents that has much violence. It's higher, and can never deals with poverty and what's under that. So I think that the intersections, mental health is the present of the humanity we're living, and that shows us that we're very bad. So we have to open our minds and to listen to this, because when we talk about intersection, I'm talking here. I'm not sure if the politicians of my country would listen to me the way you're doing. Politics doesn't easily listen to what is happening in the movement. And this is a sort of chaotic way of knowledge that's coming, that comes up from the experience. And that is something wonderful of the movement.
Thank you. So David, could you speak a little bit about the internal challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are always internal challenges in movement spaces when it comes to mental health. I think a lot of it comes from the fact that, like, the most committed activists that you're going to see are going to have the most kind of shades of oppression that come together, because they don't have the option of being an activist or not. You know, their very survival and existence is threatened by being who they are, right? And that's why I think in the United States, for example, like the gun violence prevention movement was pioneered and continues to be led by Black women, as it has been for decades, that never get the credit or attention that they deserve, right? In March for Our Lives, what made the march possible more than anything were two things, right? It was feminist activists from the Women's March that came together to help us do the march as the next march, basically. And then second with that was also, frankly, a lot of gay women and gay women of color that never got the attention that they deserved, that did the work behind the scenes and made things happen, as a lot of the men in the movement took credit for things that they had no role in whatsoever, right? Thankfully, a lot of those men are gone now, but it continued to be a problem. And I think the way that that relates to mental health is the fact that you're trying to both put oxygen masks on other people as you're trying to put one on yourself. And it's really hard when you realize that, you're getting tunnel vision and you have to put the oxygen mask on yourself because it feels very selfish. But you have to realize, I think the most important thing that we've done in the in March is realize that movements are collective actions of individuals. They're just people, right? That's all a movement is. If those individuals are not taking care of themselves, they're not doing their job to be stewards to the movement, to take care of the movement, because they are the movement, right? Each one of us is. And what that looks like is proactively including stuff so that when we were in Uvalde last summer, you know, we were marching around demanding, there was a long march in 100+ degree heat in South Texas in the middle of the summer to demand accountability from the police department, of which there were several hundred police officers waiting outside of this school where over a dozen children were murdered, right? The community was trying to demand action from the police department, and they were holding this march around the city to do that. When we were with them, I was there with my other classmate, Sam Fuentes, who literally still has shrapnel in her from the shooting to this day. When I was with her, obviously that's a very draining experience to be around all those parents and siblings that have experienced the worst thing imaginable. But what we did that was different from the past is after that day, after those marches, after meeting with those parents and protesting, I said to our team, you know, and our colleagues that were there with us, I said, okay guys, like today was obviously really exhausting. In the past, what we would have done is we would have just gone and slept, like straight to bed, right? Or just stared up at the hotel room ceiling and thought about how messed up the world is. But instead, what I said is, okay, we're gonna go and do something completely different. We're gonna go stargazing. We're gonna drive 30 minutes out of town and just look at the stars and get some good Mexican food because we're near the border and not talk about any of this awful stuff that we dealt with today. And we're just gonna breathe and look out there. And in the past, I would have thought that was a really dumb, stupid, and unnecessary thing to do. But I see, after seeing so many people come in and out of March, burning out and things like that, I know that we have to proactively rest and see that. And as a leader, I know that I have to make sure that our staff knows that that's okay too. Because if you don't come to positively associate things within the movement, if you don't celebrate the wins together, and when there aren't wins, if you don't just celebrate loving each other as a community, you're not gonna be able to build the persistence necessary to succeed. So that's been the main way that I think mental health relates to those movements, is taking those necessary breaks before you need them.
Thank you. Veronica, next, how do we create a sense of purpose and infuse people with agency to safeguard democracies? And for those who live in dictatorships today, how do we uplift them so that they can continue struggling for democracy and human rights?
Well, I will say something that it's not new, but I would say it's memory. People live longer lives today. In Chile, there's a lot of people that lived imprisonment, that lived torture. Those bodies are circulating in the city. And memory is not a place where it's not only the place where you go, and not when people is alive. So I could say that one thing is all the silence we had about the human rights violations and impunity is something that's working in our society, and we still can do something that we will not do 20 years ahead, because I'm of the youngest of that generation. So I would say memory is a good recipe, and memory is something that has to be very active. And when I was listening to Dave and in the conversations we have had yesterday, I think that when we want to build the future, today we need the past. I need to know what moved Dave from the first day to bring up the movement, as well as I knew during the dictatorship in Chile, why women could get out of the houses. They said, we brought out our voices. Politicians or politics, nor leftists, nor right, nor conservatives, could have seen the power of women in building democracies. It's like women's affairs were different. So I would say that memory is something we have to bring to the present. That means to know the legacy, but in the present now. And that reestablishes the experience of being in the world. You cannot live in a world that denies what you lived. For example, imprisonment or torture. You cannot go through the streets or talk. So I think that it's very important in this conversation of mental health and democracy to look the old things that are happening in the case of Chile in our society, but also to see the new things that young people is bringing out and are putting over the table. And for that, you had to throw away the old glasses and open your ears and listen to different things.
Thank you, Veronica. David, how would you answer that question about how to create a sense of purpose and infuse people with hope within the movement?
I think it's just, I think art plays a big role, for sure, to help inspire people, to show that, to make them feel something. I know for me that's been one of the hardest things, but I also think it's bringing in older people to show that like you're not alone in this, and like people have been doing, especially like the older women that have been doing the work in the movement way before I was alive, to make sure that the young people know that people of all ages know that it's not just on them, right? That, you know, as I'm in Greece, you know, there was just a several-day sit-in led on the steps of Congress by an 18-year-old that was a cousin of one of the kids who died in Parkland, who led that sit-in in Congress demanding a ban of assault weapons. And there he was able, just by getting different senators walking by, to get them to agree to co-sponsor the assault weapons ban in the Senate. And I think it's that really intergenerational component. As one final thing, you know, it's summed up well by us meeting John Lewis right after the shooting happened. He met with a bunch of the student organizers from March for Our Lives, and he pulled out his suit from like the civil rights movement that he bought at a thrift store for like $5 or whatever. And he said, you know, I've had this suit for a long time basically, and the number one thing I need to instill in you is that this is a marathon, not a sprint, right? And I think sometimes movements are ultra marathons with the baton pass between generations, and you have to include everybody in that. And that includes young people, but that also includes older people too. Because I hate when people come to me and say, you know, my generation really messed up. Thank God you kids are here to save us, right? When it's on all of us, and also there have been older people that have been fighting for this for decades, especially Black and brown women that have never gotten the credit that they deserve.
Thank you. I wanted to end by asking one last question. Veronica, if you could share some advice with David as something that you would like him to know, that you would have liked to know as a young feminist activist.
Oh, I'm very unsure of giving counsel. No, I would say, first, I share with David, I'm sure I share, and many people shares with you, the energy and your beliefs, your desires and your purposes when you brought up your movement. I would say we have to trust in the way we realized and what we have done. Sometimes it's very hard for a movement to believe themselves. You are not, you have no credit of authorities, or they believe that things you're saying, they're out of place. There's no place for something new, actually. We have to make room in these institutions or institutional practices or state practices to bring up spaces for little cows, different views to be there, to sit there. So I would say, let's go ahead and be sure to realize every time, because you begin with your desires, your purposes, and then in the way you see there are other movements that we can share, because humanity is about living everyday life. It's very concrete. Huh? So movements, we need to have this dialogue, these meetings, and also I will thank to you this invitation this morning.
Thank you so much, Veronica. Any responses to that, or any final thoughts you'd like to share, David?
No, I completely agree. I think the final thought that I'll have is just a point of hope that Veronica helps bring me. I mean, we have to work against the gun lobby in the United States. You were working against the US government and the CIA that was intervening in your country. And if you guys can do that and build a democracy from there, I have a lot of faith that we can probably stop kids from dying in school too. So thank you.
Well, that's a great place to end. Thank you so much, everyone, for your attention today.